All right, good morning, everybody. Good to see you all today. Just waking up, I guess. Now we're going to be wrapping up our Ruth Bible study. We've seen how Ruth and Naomi, if you will, went through a time of being emptied in their lives, how God gathered them close to himself, kept them close, prepared things for them, and now we finally see God's redemption plan in their lives unfold, something bigger than they could have never have imagined. Let's begin our time together with a prayer. Lord, in your wisdom, you do at times lead us through difficult seasons of life. Help us to trust that in all things you have a good and gracious plan for us in Jesus, our Redeemer. When you bless us and give us fullness and return our joy and our hope, may we praise you. But help us most of all remember that our final redemption is secure in him, our Savior. Amen. Right, we're going to jump right into Ruth chapter 4. Remember, I guess I'll set up the context just to remind us where we were, that in the last chapter, Naomi was kind of playing the matchmaker for Ruth and Boaz, and she tells Ruth, Boaz is our near kinsman redeemer. After he's done with the barley harvest, and he's threshed all his grain, and there's a grain pile, and he's, happy and glad that all these things have happened. When he goes to sleep at night, lay at his feet and ask him then to cover you up. And that was Ruth's way of communicating to Boaz, I need to go under the shelter of your protection. I need your help and your care to redeem the land and to redeem myself. And then Boaz said to her, I'm going to take care of this today. So let's see what happened later that day. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat there. When the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, sit down." So remember, there's one more kinsman redeemer who was a degree closer relation than Boaz was, so that's who he's talking to. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. And Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you acquire the dead man's widow in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this the kinsman redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it because it might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. Oh, thank goodness we're past those days, huh? Be a lot of shoes at Target. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so his name will not disappear from among his family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all those at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah, famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." All right, let's look at some notes here to help us understand a little bit what's going on. First of all, Boaz goes to the town gate. Now remember that in ancient times, the town gate was pretty much their equivalent of City Hall, so it was like their place where official town business was done. And we see that many times. Well, Abraham, when he wants to buy the plot of land so that Sarah can be buried, he meets with Ephron and the elders in the town gate to officially have that purchase done. We find Lot sitting in the gate of Sodom, that he becomes a person of means and a person who is influential in the city. Absalom does the same thing. He waits by the city gates as the citizens come in to complain or bring their judicial hearings to the king. He stands at the city gate there to hear them. As we learned in part 1, the Lord had commanded that land was not to be permanently sold in Israel, but only sold until the next year of Jubilee, so every 50 years. Naomi's predicament was likely quite unique, given her age and her circumstances. Okay, so she was married, has 2 sons, they get married, die before they have children, so there's no children left in that side of the family. What may the kinsman redeemer have hoped would happen? And what do you think the kinsman redeemer was, maybe when he first hears Boaz describe the situation, what do you think he might have hoped? Extra land. He might have hoped, well, a couple different things he may have hoped. He may have hoped, well, this is just a really exceptional situation where this particular subdivision of the clan of Judah and their plot of land has no male heir to take care of it, and perhaps then if I take and redeem it, there will be no heir there, and this is going to become mine. Okay, that could be one thing that he was thinking. So he is acting out of self-interest. He could have also just been trying to be an upstanding fellow, in that if the land's not sold permanently, he could just be taking and paying the price so that Naomi and Ruth can then have the land again and live on it, because that was also part of the kinsman redeemer expectations that we looked at from the previous lesson, that if someone was poor or couldn't take care of themselves, it was a job of the kinsman redeemer to give them the means to do so. One of the things here that might be kind of difficult to understand would be why at one moment he says, I'll do it, and then the next moment he says that he won't. Okay? He says, yeah, I'll do it. I'll take the land. One reason why he may have made this decision, suddenly switched his mind, has to do with, I'll say, not a textual variant, but in the Hebrew Old Testament, remember that originally it was written with all consonants and there were no vowels. Okay, so what the Masoretes did is they knew the language, just like if you saw a whole bunch of English text without vowels, you could, especially if it was something that you knew, you would be able to say, okay, this is what this is saying. All right? So they put vowels on top of the consonants. So they didn't change any of the consonants around, they put vowels on top. But in doing so, there was some points in the text where they will take and say, well, this is what's written down, but either their oral tradition takes and says, well, or the situation says it makes more sense, even though this is what's written, that this is what you say. So what is written is called the ketiv, and what was said was written in the marginal note as the kere, so what's said. In this case, on that top line on the PowerPoint there, that very last ending part there where the arrows converge, those letters, that ending should be, in what's written, is the I ending. So it's like Boaz would say, okay, you've acquired the land today, just so you know, on this day, I am going to acquire Ruth the Moabitess as my wife. okay? Because it was not required beyond outside the family that this man also marry her. Okay, that was only done inside the family among brothers, okay? So this man wasn't required to marry Ruth. But now he could have been saying, okay, you've got the land, I'm going to let you know, today I'm also marrying Ruth. And what would be the problem then? Why would he suddenly say, whoa, maybe I should change my mind on this whole purchase order? What would happen if Boaz and Ruth have a son? Yes, if Boaz and Ruth have a son, now suddenly this property he had gotten no longer his anymore, and now it belongs to that child. Another reason, even if it is the you acquire, so maybe if it was that Boaz is saying, well, you get the land and you get his widow as well, a reason for him to suddenly dial back might have been the first son that he and Ruth would have would automatically count as Mahlon's son. And if they wouldn't have any other children, then what would that mean about his family's estate? Who would it go to? It would go to that son. Does that make sense to everyone? So essentially, if he and Ruth only have one son, it would then mean that now his property is going to go into the Elimelech side of the family, if you will. Yes, all of his would then. So there could be either way you look at it, whether it's saying, I acquire Ruth as my wife, or whether it's saying, well, just so you know, you also acquire Ruth as your wife. Either one of those gives this man reason to suddenly say, oh, wait a second. Maybe this is going to endanger my property rights.
It's almost like Boaz is saying, but wait, there's more.
Kind of, yeah. But wait, there's more, yes.
So if this man already had a wife, would that have prevented him from taking?
It should have. I mean,
That's what I thought initially, is he's thinking, oh, I already have a wife, I don't need another one.
yeah. The guy, I mean, and it does not say that in the text. It doesn't tell us if he's married or not.
So where does Naomi fit into this whole thing? How come he's marrying the younger woman? Wouldn't she have been the one that would have status since she was the older of the two?
I mean, yeah, but she's not of marriageable age anymore, and the next generation has happened. So if only Elimelech had lived, then it would have been, but remember that the next generation had already happened. So Mahlon and Chilion had been born. So it's really...
So she had no rights in this really at all?
It would have technically been her property still, but it's going to be also, I guess I'm not an expert on ancient property law, but I would look at it as saying that the next generation has already happened. So
She was a Jew, whereas the other person isn't even a foreigner, really.
that, good point too. You had something, Tim?
Yeah, well, the inheritance had already happened because Elimelech died first, and then the boys died. And as far as being, she could have been considered, even though she's a foreigner, as being Jewish because she married him.
Mm-hmm.
So
I appreciate that you brought up that fine detail that Elimelech did die first, so he's already out of the picture. So the sons would have inherited the estate. Remember, so then you take in older son gets 2/3, younger son gets 1/3. Okay, so now with both of those sons gone, then at least that's how I look at it. The kinsman redeemer was motivated by his own self-interest in gaining property. What was Boaz's motivation instead? You can see this especially when you look at verse 10. So this guy's, this kinsman redeemer who was closer is saying, well, hey, what about my property and I get some sweet land or not? What is Boaz concerned about? Yes.
He's concerned with taking care of Ruth and Naomi and making things right.
Hey, he wants to do what's right, by everybody. He wants to, yes, first of all, take care of Ruth and Naomi. He wants to do what's right even by those who are dead and take and say, hey, we don't want their line to be cut off from Israel. And so I want to do what's right and preserve this family as God had told us to do back under Moses. We have the editorial comment by the author that tells us that this event took place sometime before the modern day, if you will, when it was being written, when customs were different, with the taking off of a sandal, and that's how they did land transactions in the old days, we might say. Okay, so this tells us something about, when the book is written. We'll find out in just a couple minutes that we have even more detail to understand it, at least at what point the book is written. And also it tells you that the book of Ruth took place, or the events of Ruth took place earlier in the period of the Judges possibly, as opposed to sometime that would have been closer to the time of, Samuel, David, Saul, and so on, when they wouldn't have been saying, well, way back when, people used to take and give their sandal as a way to process transactions of land.
Two questions.
Yeah.
Number one, how do we know that was his, when going back to the question, how do we know that was his true motivation? And number two, do we know that Boaz wasn't already married? Like, is there anything that says he doesn't already have a wife? I'm just to play devil's advocate here, like,
Can you restate your first question again?
like, we know that Boaz's intentions were pure, he just wanted to support them, blah,
Mhm.
blah. How do we know that, how do we know that? And then number two, is there something in here that said that he didn't already have a wife?
There's nothing that says that Boaz did not already have a wife. There's nothing that says that he did either. So I think all things equal, we just have to assume that he didn't. I mean, as we're going to see in a couple seconds, it talks about his marriage to Ruth. It talks about them having kids. Doesn't mention any other wives, marriages, or anything like that. In terms of Boaz's intentions, that's your first question. I guess I just look at, what he said, in verse 10, that he said, hey, this is what I'm concerned about. I'm worried about Ruth and Naomi. I want to take and preserve the line of descendancy like God would have us do.
The elders at the gate said, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who were the two wives of Jacob.
He does, but I mean, they do, but that could have just been like, we'll get into the blessing part of it in just a second, but that could have been just simply a way of saying, let's go back to the ancestral history of our people and really say, hey, just like Jacob and his two wives took and, if you will, launched our people, and now we are this great and mighty multitude nation. May God pronounce similar blessing upon you. So they also take and say that, may she be like Tamar, who bore Perez. Okay, so it's interesting that they give that blessing too, because Tamar, if you remember back to our Joseph lesson that we had several months ago, so Tamar, that's the one who was originally married to Judah's oldest son, and then he was wicked and God puts him to death, and she marries on the next oldest son. He was wicked and God puts him to death, and then she's supposed to marry the third son of Judah, but Judah says, well, there must be something about this woman. My sons that get married to her keep on dying. So he doesn't let that marriage happen, And then remember, Tamar takes things into her own hands, and she ends up in a conniving way getting Judah to sleep with her, and then she has children. One of them is Perez, who then forms the family line of Judah, which is the family line that Boaz and his family come from. But that was a Levirate marriage situation too. So that's what this is as well. So it makes sense for them to at least say, hey, may you be blessed just like Tamar was blessed with Perez. And here we are essentially saying that same thing to Ruth. The town elders pronounced an exceptional blessing on Boaz and Ruth's union. Like I just said, Perez was Boaz's ancestor, was himself a product of Levirate practice, although it was fulfilled in an extraordinary way, and his clan contributed to Judah rising to prominence in Israel. Remember that Judah was pretty much the strongest clan in the south, and Ephraim was the strongest one in the north. As we shall see shortly, this prophetic blessing was fulfilled. Could we hereby learn something of retaining or regaining the practice of passing God's blessing on to others? How can we do so appropriately? So, like I said, we have the elders of the town gate blessing the marriage of Boaz and Ruth. I'm just wondering, I asked this question because I'm wondering, do we do such things? Do we say to people, may the Lord bless you? You hear it in church on Sunday from pastor, but do we say it to each other? Do we say it to others? And if we do so, how could we do it appropriately? What things could we do and what things might we maybe want to avoid?
I think if it's a clear Bible promise that can be applied globally, then there's nothing wrong with repeating that to another person.
Excellent. So one thing that we want to do when it comes to, if you will, passing God's blessing on someone is make sure we've got God's promise behind it, right? An example of such universal promises might be something like, I think of the fourth commandment that we looked at last week, right? Where God says to children that when they honor their father and mother, you'll have a good, long life. That would be an example. What does God say when it comes to helping those who are disadvantaged or poor? What does God say about that? Okay, yeah, and he says, in the Old Testament too, he says, who lends to the poor gives to the Lord. Or I'm paraphrasing, but pretty close to that. So, God says that Paul says, whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Okay, so if we live generous lives, and remember again, generosity is not a matter of, quantity like millions or something. Well, if I don't give a huge gift, or if I don't give in huge numbers, then it doesn't pay or doesn't matter. God sees the heart and considers, 2 widow's coins to be worth more than everything else that anyone gave. So when we have something where we have God's promise behind it, we can speak in blessing. So that's one thing that's important. How else, what other things might we want to consider when it comes to pronouncing a blessing on somebody else?
I'm not sure how this fits in, but I'm thinking of when we install like teachers or church officers or whatever, and we ask God to bless them in their work.
Okay, and we know that's another example of another area where God promises he will do so. Okay, because God says, this is the work of my kingdom. It's not about you, the person. It's about God's kingdom. And God promises He is going to equip those who serve to be able to provide His church with what it needs. Weddings, baptisms, funerals. Okay, things like that where, again, we have God's promise behind them. I also think about, should we bless someone? I'm going to say it would be better for us to be more general in what we say. Let's say someone helps you out of a bind, a financial bind or something. And you say to them, may God bless you. May He give you 5 times back what you've given to me, or something like that. Well, that's nice of you to say. May God do that? I guess He may. But unless you've got that promise from the Lord that He's going to do such, that's probably not the best way to put it. Better thing might be to say just simply, God bless you for your generosity to me. And then let God do it. And God can do way more than 5, if you will. We might say something and say, well, I think like that seems like a lot. Like that would be a big blessing if God would do that for that person. But we have a God who says, I can do immeasurably more than all you can ask or imagine, right? So our idea of what might be a blessing for someone, God might say, well, I got all this, planned. So we want to be careful that way, and if you will, and leave room for God to be able to do the wonderful things that He does by not putting any kind of a limit on it. Anything else on that matter? I just, the reason why I brought up, I think that, maybe something that we as, I'll say maybe as Lutherans don't do as much, or don't maybe think of quite as much. We think of thanking God, but we don't necessarily maybe think as much of saying, praying for, God also bless these other people through who have been your agents to me of kindness and grace.
But on the other hand, then you don't bless something or actions or attitudes that are contrary to God's word.
True.
That's the other side of the coin.
True. That's another thing to be careful with, that we don't want to give anyone an impression that we're either supporting something that is not God-pleasing. Any questions so far in chapter 4? Continuing. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. Women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. What should be a believer's attitude towards the matters of pregnancy, birth, children, and so on? We've got an example here of it with Boaz and Ruth. I guess what does it say here? What can we take from the example of Boaz and Ruth when it comes to God and it comes to matters of birth, life, and so on? Yes?
The woman here give praise to God for giving this wonderful gift.
All right, so when baby is born and thereafterwards, praising God for giving this wonderful gift of a child. That's one thing. What does it say about when, it says Boaz went to her, and what happened?
She became pregnant.
What?
She became pregnant.
Yes, and it even states that, the Lord enabled her to conceive, okay? So realizing that, conception is something that the Lord gives, where and when he wants to. And we see this in some of these other passages. Deuteronomy 32:39. See now that I myself am he, there is no God besides me. I put to death and I bring to life. I have wounded and I will heal, and no one can deliver out of my hand. So when it comes to life's beginning and even life's ending, God says, that's all me. I'm the one who starts life. I'm the one who is to take life away. Psalm 139, King David wrote that. So you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. Now when it comes to who we are, what characteristics and traits we have, and David says, Lord, you created all of me. You even created my inmost being and made me the way you wanted me to be. Genesis 29 says, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So some people might, in these situations, a couple might wonder, well, why us or why them and not us? And those are difficult things to wrestle with and can be, very faith challenging. But again, passages like this tell us that, the Lord says, when it's my time, my will, God says, I will cause life to happen. And as Blake mentioned, realizing as Naomi and Boaz and Ruth did, that children are a gift from the Lord. They are a reward from him. What do the townswomen and surely Naomi herself finally realize?
God was in control of the whole situation.
Okay, God was in control in the whole situation. And think about how much she had lost, and what do they even say to her? I find it amazing what they say to her about Ruth.
Naomi has a son, and that Ruth was better to her than 7 sons.
Wow. That God took and turned this whole thing around. Now Naomi, if you will, has a son. Yes, it's her grandson, but really it's going to count as her son and carrying on the family line. And she lost 2 sons, but she gained a daughter-in-law who they say is, better to her than even 7 sons could be. Imagine you were Naomi now. How might you be feeling? How might you look back on life? How would Naomi feel at the end of chapter 1 when she comes back to Bethlehem? Yeah, she was bitter and angry. She says, call me Mara instead, and the Lord's made my life very bitter. If you were her now, how might you be feeling, and how might you look back on your life? Okay, you might be saying to yourself, why did I doubt God? Why did I ever, think that, well, maybe he doesn't care about me, or he doesn't have a good plan for me?
I would be in awe of how God worked through my situation.
and how he worked through things that were super difficult and painful, right? I mean, I think that's one of the real amazing things about the story is that from a human perspective, Naomi and Ruth, go through some of the worst of it. And yet, God still worked. And God could take all that heartache and pain and loss, and he can turn it around. Thinking that God really does care, like he says in his word, really does care for the poor, the widow, and the fatherless, the stranger, the alien. It was undoubtedly hard for Naomi that she had lost her husband and her 2 sons. As Christians, when when God calls a loved one home, we lose them only temporarily. And in this case, Naomi then, through all that happened, got to gain one more. Got to gain a daughter-in-law who was going to be hers, if you will, forever. So yes, she had temporary loss, but with Ruth, she would have eternal gain. Verses 18 through 22, this then is the family line of Perez. So now it goes back to Perez that the elders had just mentioned. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. We should note here this is an example of what we might call a telescoped genealogy, where father of likely means forefather or ancestor. If it wouldn't, if someone would say, nope, it must mean the direct father of, or this person, begat this one, well, that would mean that these 9 generations from Perez to King David would have to span 800 plus years. Okay. Matthew's genealogy of Christ tells us that Boaz's mother was Rahab. It says there that his mother was Rahab. So we have good reason to believe that, again, Ruth took place in the early part of the Judges, perhaps, in the first generation or so after the conquest of Canaan. It would mean that the next 3 generations of Obed, Jesse, and David would have had to span 300 plus years, which seems to be a huge stretch. We can say this is a telescope genealogy and be just fine with it, because even in Jesus Christ's own genealogy that Matthew records, there are some skips in the chain. If you look at Matthew 1:9, it talks about one king begetting another, but we know from the history of kings that there's 3 generations in between. So instead, what this is likely doing is saying, okay, here's my family ancestry. I'm not giving you every single person, every single link in the chain, but here are the big ones. Or here's maybe where the turns in the family happen. So that's the same thing that's going on here. What information in this genealogy, though, gives us a general clue as to the period in which the book of Ruth was written. What can we know from this list saying, okay, this book has to be written by this time or after this time?
Well, before the period of the kings, because Jesse's David's father, and Jesse was Ruth and Boaz's grandson.
Okay.
That pretty well hands it down, doesn't it?
All right? Anything else? Yep.
We've got the business practices that were in place.
Say that again.
We've got the business practices that were in place that would indicate.
Okay, the business practices that, when it came to transacting land, that changed. And it ends with King David. So that tells us that the author who wrote this said, this kid David's going to be like a big deal. Otherwise, if I was doing like my family genealogy, much as I like my sons, I wouldn't necessarily put out there like, hey, and then Xander was born. And expect the whole rest, everyone who's reading this to be like, oh yes, Xander, of course. So it's written, must have been written at no earlier than the point of time in which the name David is a big deal. Okay, so if that's during the reign of David maybe, or Solomon, or who knows.
I'm exhibiting my warped sense of humor, so every 50 years they got their shoes back.
I don't, maybe. This is great-great-grandpa's shoe, possibly. Some possible reflections for us. Let's list who or what all got redeemed in this brief account. So talking about just the book of Ruth and, how that redemption finally takes place here at the end. What things all got redeemed? If you were going to look at how does that theme of redemption well fit this book?
Naomi and her immediate, Ruth, they all got redeemed back. They weren't fatherless, so to speak, anymore.
Yeah. So Naomi and Ruth get redeemed. Okay, so they get their. Well, I'll wait. I don't want to give the rest away. What other things get redeemed? So Naomi and Ruth get redeemed.
We get redeemed.
Hey, we end up, we have a redeemer too. So these things remind us that going back to lesson 1, though we were and are poor and powerless, that God has mercy upon us. He sees the lowly. And He redeemed us from all of our sins and from death itself. What else gets redeemed? We could also say, the family property and prosperity gets redeemed. Naomi and Ruth get redeemed, if you will, physically, where, now they no longer have to, be living on welfare, let's say, gleaning in the fields. Ruth is married, she has children, they have land, prosperity returns. They get redeemed, spiritually too. Naomi was in a crushed, feeling forsaken place, and God lifts her up to joy, hope, peace.
This is another example of that redemption is for all people, not just the Jews.
Yes. Okay, so that's the other thing about the story is that, Ruth was from outside God's people. And remember, she gets brought in. What does this account teach us about the course of a believer's ordinary life?
God works all those things for the good of those who love Him.
Hey, God works all things for the good of those who love Him. What a special verse for us to always keep in mind. What else does this tell us about a believer's ordinary life?
It isn't always going to be easy.
Okay, yes, it is. There are times when it's going to be very difficult. And that's where faith comes in, right? Where we say, Lord, I'm still going to hang on to you, even though things look bleak, even though it doesn't look like I have a good reason to hang on to you. But because your Son hung on the cross for me, I have reason to hang on to you. What else does this tell us about a believer's ordinary life? Do you think that Naomi or Ruth ever imagined that they would be part of this, God's huge salvation plan, especially when they were at their low point, if you will? They probably thought, we've been kicked to the curb, we're off to the side, and we're nobodies. But God didn't just have like a little plan for them, He had a huge plan for them. And the rest of their lives, yes, apart from, Ruth marrying Boaz and them having the son, that was exceptional. But what happened generations down the line, too? Right? Let's not forget that. Now, we might look at our lives, and God's purpose for us might not be some awesome thing in our life, or your life, or my life. But it may be that He used us to shape 1, 2, 3, how many generations down the line. And God may do something that's beyond anything we can imagine. So my point is that as you go through your everyday life, you might say, another day at the office or another day doing whatever. I wish I could just do something important or whatever. God has you where you are doing something important. You just may not realize it. Respond to the following critique of the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is misogynistic, in other words, women-hating, because it reinforces traditional stereotypes that women are powerless and must look to and rely on men for sustenance, protection, and fulfillment. What things might we say to push back against such a critique?
You can't look at the story with today's principles and stereotypes. I mean, that's how things worked back then.
Thank you. I think that's really important for us, especially in our current culture, to remember that, the current fad is I'm going to look at history through 2024 perspective, and if things don't match how we happen to do things right now, then they were wrong, they were backwards, and we have it all together. We're the ones who, I don't know, if more arrogant words could be, arrogant thought point of view could be, then we've got it all together, because our world is sure perfect right now, right? We all know that. We're real close.
I was going to say that Ruth went and provided by picking up the grain and stuff like that, and that was typically a man's role, not a woman's role. And she was also caretaker, but she was also providing
Yeah.
for herself and for her.
So, she shows herself to be a woman of strength, right? And she is industrious. And think of it, too, that, there's plenty of things in the story that don't fit the mold. She was a Moabitess. If this would have been just a story where you're trying to, dump dirt on somebody, well, then, you could have taken, and if the author then could have taken and done things to portray her in a much more negative light as a foreigner and a former idol worshiper and those kinds of things. But she is lifted high and said, this woman, and she's an example. Think about how Boaz even says, wow, the virtue by which you live, you supplied your mother-in-law, you've shown her your love, you've come under God's care, you don't run after the rich men, you don't run after the young men, you've shown yourself to be someone of virtue. Okay? Any other ways we could push back at this concept? You said before that, that's how things were, that's how their society was structured and organized, and in the end, to a degree, we all have to function within the rules of a society, how it's organized. But who in this story ends up being the one who's the real provider, the real protector, the real fulfiller? God is, right? I mean, and throughout the whole thing, it just so happened that God had her go to the field of Boaz. And it just so happened that Boaz was a near kinsman redeemer. And it just so happened that this other one, the nearer one, didn't want to redeem the land and redeem Ruth. And God provides the child. And God, it's all God.
It just
Yes.
so happens that Ruth became a believer. And people want to zero in on the small picture instead of looking at the big picture.
Yes. Okay, looking at the big picture of this is ultimately a story about God's faithfulness and what God can do. So Ruth and Naomi, while characters, they're just characters in as far as they're pointing us to what God does. He's the central character of Scripture, and Jesus Christ, of course, and his grand redemption story being the biggest one. This question here is just meant to take us back to that whole idea of redemption stories and saying, how is God's redemption story and our human-made redemption stories different? So when it comes to the good redemption stories that you may read or see in the movies, how is that different from how God redeemed us?
It's what the person does to redeem themselves, lift them out of the hole they're in, or, change their own adversity into better.
So our stories are more often about ourselves, and they're about, the person who's in that challenging, tight spot, they then pick themselves up, right? And they overcome. Whereas God's redemption story is one about him overcoming for us. We get ourselves and have put ourselves in the bad spot. God's redemption story is that he lifts us out. He provides the redemption. Next week, we'll be starting a new Bible study, Gifted to Serve. During the month of October, we're going to have our gifted stewardship emphasis. So we'll focus on the talents that God has given us and how those are spirit-given and meant to be God-directed and also others-centered as well. So we'll start looking at the way that God gives us gifts, where they come from, and how they are to be used. So that'll start next week, Sunday. God's blessings on you till then.